This is the 10th and final episode in a bonus series of Real Democracy Now!, a podcast, talking about deliberation, culture and context.
What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now! I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now! Is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Welcome to episode 10 in this special bonus series of Real Democracy Now!, a podcast about deliberation, culture and context. This bonus series has been made in collaboration with the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. In this series, I've spoken with most of the presenters at the Centre's Conference on Deliberation, Culture and Context, which was held in early December 2017. This conference brought together scholars from around the world to examine the different forms, meanings and significance associated with deliberation in various cultures and contexts. A copy of the conference program is available in the show notes. This conference was supported by John Dryzek's ARC Laureate Fellowship entitled Deliberative Worlds, Democracy, Justice and a Changing Earth System. In this final episode of the bonus series, I'm speaking with Professor John Dryzek.
So this is John Dryzek. I'm in the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. I've been here several years. And I've worked in deliberative democracy for, I think, several decades and have written several books on the topic over the years.
I spoke with John about his ARC Laureate Fellowship, his reflections on the conference generally, how we might establish global deliberative processes, and his views on directions for future research in this area. So, John, I know that you have an ARC Laureate Fellowship and that the fellowship was part of supporting the conference on deliberation, culture and context. Can you tell us a bit about the fellowship and how the conference came about?
The fellowship fully funded the conference. The title of the fellowship is Deliberative Worlds, Democracy, Justice and a Changing Earth System. It's an ARC Laureate Fellowship, so it was funded for a total of $2.6 million for the duration of 5 years. And essentially, the project has three pillars. So one of the pillars is global environmental governance. The second one is global justice. And the third is deliberative cultures. So the idea of the first two pillars is to take a deliberative approach to both global environmental governance and global justice. And then the justification for the third pillar, the cultural one, is that if you're dealing with global issues of any sort, they're going to involve people from different cultures. And the basic assumption is that deliberative practices, deliberative norms differ across different cultures. And so that's really a justification for thinking about how cultures play into these more global questions. Although in the conference itself, we really did move off into questions of deliberative cultures per se. And the question of global governance, I think, was hardly raised except in Melissa Williams' talk. So that's the basic justification. We've held one conference a year under the Laureate Fellowship and will continue until the fellowship ends in the end of 2019.
Oh, wonderful. That's very interesting. Okay. And you were at the conference. I've spoken to a lot of the people who presented papers at the conference. What's your reflections on presentations at the conference? What sort of came out of the conference overall?
I actually find it a bit hard to sort of summarize any overall theme. So I'll just pick out one or two things which I thought were interesting. Obviously, the speakers are very capable and really did provide a lot of really illuminating thoughts on different aspects of deliberative cultures and also different contexts in different parts of the world. So, of course, context should not necessarily be equated with cultures. There is something to think about in terms of what we actually mean by cultures and how do we go about studying them. And John Parkinson, in his comments on the concluding panel, reminded us that we shouldn't think of cultures as being unitary wholes within which people are somehow imprisoned. That cultures can be fluid. We can think of the number of cultures in the world is I think potentially infinite. Cultures can always be contested and they involve processes of meaning making to which deliberation can contribute. So with that's a kind of a warning in mind. I think I came away with reinforced sense of the richness of different deliberative cultures and contexts, and how different practices can be in different places. I think I'm still committed to the idea that deliberation is a universal human capacity, that anyone, anywhere can do it. But the way deliberation is manifested will vary widely in different cultures and different contexts. So that's a case of having one conception reinforced. And in terms of general lessons, I think one of the other general lesson is that it's important not to romanticize other cultures. Also, relatedly, not to seek in them deliberative ideals that might be sort of part of one's own preconception about what good deliberation is, and then just going to seek those good things in other cultures. I think it's important to understand different cultures and contexts in their own terms, to be prepared to learn from them, but not to romanticize them, and also not to seek in them only the good things that you've already determined are positive. And then another sort of related question, which Quinlan Bowman stressed in his comments in the final session, concerns the degree to which we should be confident in being able to evaluate what's going on in different cultures and contexts. I think there's a tendency to, when dealing with very, very different cultures and contexts, not to be too judgmental. And that really came across, I think, in Mark Warren's talk on Indigenous Cree practices of deliberation in Canada, in which he essentially emphasized the positive and really didn't have much to say by way of critique. Now, we should, of course, be careful when it comes to criticizing other cultures or other practices. But it seems to me there are two kinds of cases when we can, in fact, engage in that kind of criticism. The first is if the context in question has a state, and this is sort of really brought out in Stephanie Lawson's presentation, where she's talking about Pacific Islands, where the cultural practices in question have found a home in the governance of a state. And then I think there's no problem in criticizing, as she did, some of the implications of appeals to more consensual approaches to politics and how they, in some cases, sort of reinforce hierarchies and should not be beyond criticism. That's one context. The other context is a bit different. And this goes back to actually a PhD that I supervised by Katie Kirchin at ANU. And Katie was at the conference, which is on the ethics of criticizing other cultures. And basically, she said that one should not criticize other cultures if one stands in a hierarchical relationship in relation to those cultures, in the sense of being part of a society which dominates the culture in question. So that means that one should not criticize indigenous cultural practices if one is part of a society that is oppressing indigenous cultures. On the other hand, and this is a case that Katie looks at, cultural defences against criticism don't work if they are undertaken by a relatively privileged, or maybe even a group of equal standing. So the case she introduces in her thesis, or analyses in her thesis, is a very interesting one of fox hunters in England who defended fox hunting against a majority who wished to ban it on the grounds that it was a cultural practice that was of value in rural communities. So I think Katie argued quite successfully that those sorts of practices, because they're carried out by a relatively privileged group, can be subject to criticism by outsiders. Those are some considerations that one should bear in mind when it comes to evaluating deliberative practices that one finds in different contexts. Yeah, so those were some of the main lessons that I drew. There were lots of more particular things I could talk about in relation to the individual papers, but in terms of sort of general questions, I think that would capture what I thought was most important.
With there being different approaches to deliberation around the world, depending on culture and so on, how do you think we might establish global deliberative processes, or is that actually not a useful thing to be aiming for?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think we're a long way from figuring out how global deliberative processes should respond to cultural difference. So I think we can, though, go ahead in building those processes. We can't simply wait until we figured out the variety of cultural practices that matter when in relation to global deliberation, because we could be waiting forever. So I think we do need to build global deliberative democracy as a matter of some urgency. But as we do so, and if we do encounter problems with cultural difference, we should be alive to the possibilities for doing something about that. So let me just give you, perhaps just one example. That there's in the context of global biodiversity negotiations, there is currently an Indigenous Peoples Forum which meets in parallel with the Convention on Biodiversity, which meets every 2 years. That's one thing on the agenda. I mean, haven't done this yet. Is to examine the degree to which the practices in the official negotiations take into account the particular kinds of practices that have developed in the Indigenous Peoples Forum, and whether there are any barriers to the deliberative participation of that forum in the larger deliberative system, which is organised around or rather can be interpreted as being organised around the biodiversity negotiations. So that's just one example of something to be taken into account. Actually, interesting that in global negotiations right now there is something of a reverse, I'm not sure what to call it, maybe reverse colonization going on. That in the climate change negotiations, for example, there was reference at the 2015 Conference of the Parties. There was some use made of indabas, which are basically, an indaba is essentially a Southern African deliberative practice. And the idea was to take people out of the formal negotiations into these more informal groups, which are styled as indabas, in order to more effectively resolve differences between some key parties and produce something more constructive to take to the official negotiations. So that's just one example. When Fiji was the chair of the last Conference of the Parties of Climate Change negotiations at the end of 2017, and there was a similar proposal for adopt a Pacific Island cultural practice, whose name I'm blanking on. But anyway, it was a similar idea of trying to use that in global negotiations. So it's interesting to see these different deliberative cultures trying to make themselves felt in global negotiations. And so, how that plays out and whether it really makes a difference will be something interesting to follow.
Thanks for that. The final follow-up question I've got relates to what do you see as future directions for research in the area of deliberative cultures?
If you look at the kind of work that the conference presenters were doing, I mean, it's very, very different. Some of it is, well, in the case of Melissa Williams, it was very much political theory, but certainly informed by some real-world cases. There's case study research. That was really Stephanie Lawson's work on Pacific Islands was just a collection of case studies, essentially. There was systematic quantitative work being done by Vijayendra Rao on deliberation in Indian villages. So it seems there are multiple methods that one can apply. Now, if one thinks of culture and the method, the appropriate method as being ethnographic, and that's fine. I mean, that is in some ways that's the sort of the standard method for investigating cultures, and so there's plenty of scope for ethnographic study of deliberative cultures. But again, the question is, well, where do you start and where do you stop? And I suppose the answer to that is you can start pretty much anywhere, and that the number of possibilities for studying particular deliberative culture is, as I said earlier, almost infinite. So there's enormous scope for an agenda of studying deliberative cultures. Now, in terms of what would guide the agenda for inquiry, I think the best answer can be found in Melissa Williams' paper, which was really all about deparochializing political theory and democratic theory in particular, and deliberative democratic theory more precisely. So in that sense, I think what she's looking for, different sources of ideas for political theory. So rather than just taking the traditional Western canon and its variations and its critiques and so forth as our starting point, we should be more egalitarian in our starting points and look for resources in many different places. So that would be one answer of what should guide, or one source of guidelines to the research agenda. The question, though, there is, well, what sorts of things do we then look for? Because it seems most of the people who are doing comparative political theory in the Melissa Williams fashion actually themselves come out of the Western tradition. And so what they think are interesting questions are actually conditioned by that tradition. So the bigger challenge is to figure out what interesting questions about deliberation look like in non-Western cultures and context, and to take those on board in crafting a research agenda. And I don't think anyone's really begun to do that, but that's maybe the next the next phase.
So look, I had another question, and what you've just said then might suggest an answer. But let's say you could get $1 million to undertake new research in the area of deliberative culture. What would you like to spend it on?
Right. I'd probably make a slight difference between what I think would advance the field and what would advance my own research. In terms of advancing the field, I think probably trying to approach exactly that last question, to try and figure out what the important questions are from the perspective of different cultures and contexts, and then sort of building up from those into some more general set of questions. And now I come to think of it, the paper by Emmanuel Arney, in a way, is suggested at the beginning there, because he was concerned, for him, the key problem was the degree to which aggressive speech precedes violence. And that clearly he has African contexts in mind where you can empirically observe aggressive speech as a prelude to political violence. So trying to figure out ways of controlling that sort of speech so that violence doesn't happen looks like a key question from his African perspective, which is perhaps not recognized as a key question in more standard deliberative theory. So that would be the beginning of that kind of that kind of, if you like, bottom-up generation of what the key questions are that political theory and empirical analysis need to address.
So you hinted at a different area of research if it was to advance your own research agenda. What would you be looking there?
I think there it would be, because my own agenda at the moment is so concerned with questions of global governance, I think it would involve doing much more on empirically investigating just how different deliberative practices play into process of global governance, not just the formal negotiations, but also all the informal stuff that happens around the global negotiations, all the things that happen in global civil society, all the things that happen in networked government initiatives that stand in only very loose relation to multilateral processes. So that would be my own personal agenda there.
In the next episode of the podcast, we'll be back to Season 3, looking at elections, electoral systems and alternatives. In Episode 5 of Season 3, I'll be talking with Professor Pippa Norris about electoral integrity. I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.